The masks you've worn for decades are starting to feel uncomfortable. That sensation of living a life that feels like a prison made from other people's expectations isn't a coincidence. It's your authentic self asking for passage. If you've been feeling like something inside you is shifting, that certain things that once made sense now seem empty, you're not having a breakdown. You're having a spiritual awakening. But here's what nobody tells you about this process. It's not a sudden switch where everything changes overnight. It's a slow, almost imperceptible journey of small abandonments that happen without you even realizing it. It's like developing an intolerance to inauthenticity. The more awakened you become, the more your body, mind, and soul automatically reject what isn't genuine. Joe Dispenza discovered there are 7 specific things that all people slowly quit during this awakening process. These are patterns so deeply ingrained that you probably haven't even noticed you're breaking free from them. But when you understand these 7 invisible surrenders, everything about your spiritual journey will make sense. And you'll finally understand why your life has been feeling so different lately. I remember sitting across from Maria, a successful executive who'd built her entire career on pleasing others. She described this strange phenomenon that started happening during her spiritual awakening. Every time someone asked for her approval or validation, she'd literally feel nauseous. "It's like my body developed an intolerance to people-pleasing," she said, comparing it to how diabetics slowly quit consuming sugar because their bodies simply can't handle it anymore. What fascinated me was how her authentic self was rejecting the very thing her ego had craved for decades. This wasn't a conscious decision, it was her inner worth finally saying enough. As she shared her story, I realized how many of us mistake external approval for genuine happiness. We're constantly seeking that next validation hit, whether it's from our boss, our family, or even strangers on social media. But here's what most people don't understand, that approval never fills the void inside. It's like trying to fill a bucket with holes. No matter how much water you pour, it keeps emptying. The spiritual journey slowly reveals this truth, and suddenly the very act of seeking external validation becomes physically uncomfortable. The most profound shift happens when someone realizes their need for approval has been a form of self-abandonment. They've been bypassing their own inner guidance system, trading their authentic voice for the temporary comfort of being liked. I've watched clients go through what feels like withdrawal, the isolation that comes from no longer performing for others' approval. But in that space, something beautiful emerges. The certainty that comes from knowing your own inner worth doesn't depend on anyone else's opinion. This transformation isn't always smooth. There's often blame directed at family members or society for making them approval seekers in the first place. But the real freedom comes when they stop pointing fingers and start taking responsibility for their own spiritual evolution. They begin to understand that every moment spent chasing approval was actually a detour from discovering their authentic self. The question becomes, are you ready to trust your inner compass even when it leads you away from the crowd? The truth about letting go of approval seeking goes deeper than most realize. It's not just about confidence or self-esteem. It's about stepping into a completely different way of being. When you're no longer performing for others, you discover parts of yourself that have been hidden for years. This process of individuation can feel lonely at first, but it's the gateway to genuine connection with others who appreciate your real self. But here's where it gets really interesting, and what I'm about to share next might challenge everything you think you know about standing out from the crowd. The paradox of spiritual awakening is that many people trade one ego trap for another. I've witnessed countless individuals who quit seeking approval from mainstream society only to become addicted to being seen as special within spiritual circles. They collect certifications, attend every retreat, and speak in enlightened buzzwords, but they're still performing, just for a different audience. It's like they grew wings to escape their old limitations, but those very wings became new chains, binding them to a spiritual identity that's just as imprisoning as any other role they've played. There's something particularly seductive about spiritual specialness because it feels so much more evolved than regular ego needs. I remember working with a yoga instructor who constantly spoke about being chosen for her spiritual gifts, yet she couldn't handle criticism about her teaching style. Her entire sense of worth was tied to being perceived as more awakened than others. The truth is, when you're truly connected to your authentic self, there's no need to broadcast your spiritual status. It simply radiates naturally through your being. The real breakthrough comes when someone realizes that their quest to be spiritually special is actually bypassing the beauty of their ordinary humanness. True individuation isn't about standing above others. It's about diving so deep into your own unique essence that comparisons become irrelevant. I've seen people spend years in isolation, meditating and studying, convinced they're achieving higher consciousness, when really they're avoiding the messy, beautiful work of being genuinely human in relationship with others. What's fascinating is how the ego co-opts even our most sincere spiritual efforts. Someone might start a meditation practice seeking inner peace, but before long, they're measuring their progress against others, collecting spiritual experiences like trophies. The need for certainty about their spiritual advancement becomes another form of seeking external validation. They just want approval from spiritual authorities instead of conventional ones. This creates a subtle form of spiritual materialism that's often harder to recognize than regular ego patterns. The shift happens when you realize that your authentic self doesn't need to be special to be valuable. There's profound freedom in discovering that your ordinary, flawed, beautifully human experience is already complete. When you stop trying to transcend your humanness and start embracing it fully, that's when real transformation begins. Your spiritual journey becomes less about achieving some elevated state and more about showing up authentically in each moment, regardless of how enlightened it looks to others. The most liberating truth about releasing the need to be special is that it opens the door to genuine happiness, but not the kind most people are chasing. What I'm about to reveal about the performance of happiness might completely shift how you understand what it means to be truly fulfilled. I'll never forget Sarah, a therapist who'd built her entire practice on being the eternally positive healer. She had inspirational quotes on her walls, always wore a bright smile, and spoke in that soothing, uplifting tone that clients expected. But when she lost her teenage son in a car accident, something broke inside her, not just from grief, but from the realization that she couldn't fake happiness anymore. She described sitting in her office, staring at a Choose Joy poster, feeling like a complete fraud. Her spiritual awakening began the moment she admitted to her clients that she was drowning, that positivity wasn't going to heal this wound. Most people don't realize how exhausting it is to maintain the performance of happiness. Think about your own daily interactions. How often do you say, "I'm fine," when someone asks how you are, even when you're struggling? We've all been trained to put on this mask, to show up as the version of ourselves that won't make others uncomfortable. But here's what's fascinating. When Sarah finally quit performing happiness and allowed herself to be authentically vulnerable, her clients actually connected with her on a deeper level. Her genuine sadness created more healing space than years of forced positivity ever could. This isn't just about being negative or pessimistic. It's about stopping the bypassing of real emotions. I've seen people spend decades in therapy or spiritual work, always trying to think their way into happiness, never allowing themselves to feel what's actually present. They'll meditate away their anger, journal away their fear, or affirmation away their sadness. But emotions aren't problems to be solved. They're messengers carrying important information about our authentic self. When we honor them instead of trying to fix them, That's where real transformation happens. The pressure to be happy all the time is particularly intense in spiritual communities. People wear their happiness like a badge of honor, proof that they're doing the work correctly. But forced happiness is just another form of spiritual performance, another way the ego tries to maintain control. True inner worth comes from accepting the full spectrum of human experience. The joy and the sorrow, the clarity and the confusion, the love and the fear. When you give yourself permission to feel it all without judgment, you discover a kind of authentic happiness that doesn't depend on circumstances. What I've learned from witnessing hundreds of people drop this performance is that genuine happiness isn't something you chase or create. It's something that naturally emerges when you stop trying so hard to be happy. It's like trying to catch your own shadow. The harder you chase it, the more it eludes you. But when you turn around and face the light, the shadow falls naturally behind you. This kind of organic joy comes from alignment with truth rather than resistance to what is. The real revelation about happiness will challenge everything you've been taught about positive thinking. What comes next will show you why your need for certainty might be the very thing blocking your path to genuine peace. Dr. Marcus was a quantum physicist who'd spent his entire career building mathematical models to explain the universe. He had equations for everything, formulas that gave him a sense of control over the chaos of existence. But during his spiritual awakening, something unsettling happened. All his scientific certainties started feeling like elaborate stories he'd been telling himself. He described it as entering a cloud of not knowing, where his need for concrete answers became a source of anxiety rather than comfort. The man who once explained particle behavior couldn't even explain why he felt so drawn to sit in silence every morning, watching his thoughts dissolve into mystery. This hunger for certainty shows up everywhere in our daily lives. We check our phones obsessively for updates. We research every decision to death on Google. We ask friends for advice about situations only we can truly understand. We've become addicted to the illusion that if we just gather enough information, we can control outcomes. But spiritual awakening slowly reveals that this need for certainty is actually what keeps us stuck. It's like trying to swim while clinging to the edge of the pool. You'll never discover your natural buoyancy until you let go and trust the water to hold you. I've watched people spend years in analysis paralysis, trying to figure out their life purpose, their soulmate, their perfect career path, when the truth is that life unfolds through living, not through planning. Take something as simple as choosing what to eat for dinner. Some people can spend 20 minutes reading restaurant reviews and checking nutritional information when their body already knows what it needs if they just listen. The authentic self operates from intuition and presence, not from the ego's need to have everything mapped out in advance. The most profound shift happens when someone realizes that uncertainty isn't the enemy of spiritual growth. It's the doorway. Marcus described it perfectly. It's like diving into dark waters without knowing how deep they go, but trusting that you'll know how to navigate once you're in. This isn't reckless abandonment of wisdom. It's recognizing that true wisdom often comes from embracing the unknown. When you stop trying to control every variable, you discover an inner compass that's far more reliable than any external map. Learning to dance with uncertainty requires a fundamental shift in how you relate to life. Instead of seeing the unknown as something to be conquered or figured out, you start experiencing it as the fertile ground where all possibilities exist. This is where real freedom lives, not in having all the answers, but in being comfortable with questions. When you release your grip on needing to know how everything will unfold, you create space for life to surprise you in ways your limited planning never could have imagined. The journey from needing certainty to trusting the flow reveals something most people never expect about taking responsibility for their lives. But first, you need to understand why blame might be the invisible prison keeping you stuck in old patterns. Linda came to me carrying a story she'd told herself for 30 years, that her inability to maintain relationships was entirely due to her emotionally unavailable father and codependent mother. She had the psychology perfectly mapped out: how her childhood trauma created attachment wounds, how her parents' dysfunction taught her to attract unavailable partners. Every failed relationship was evidence of her victimhood, proof that she was damaged goods trying to heal in a world that didn't understand her pain. But during one session, something shifted. She looked at me and said, "I just realized I've been using my trauma as an excuse to avoid taking responsibility for my choices." A day that was her spiritual awakening beginning, the moment she stopped giving her power away to the past. The blame game is seductive because it temporarily relieves us of the burden of responsibility. When your boss is unreasonable, your partner doesn't understand you, your family doesn't support your dreams, or society doesn't appreciate your authentic self, it's easier to point fingers than to ask the hard question, what's my part in this pattern? I've watched people spend decades in therapy, spiritual workshops, and healing circles, collecting evidence of how they've been wronged, when the real transformation happens the moment they pick up the key that's been in their pocket all along: their power to choose differently. This doesn't mean bypassing real trauma or pretending that abuse didn't happen. It means recognizing that while you may not have been responsible for what happened to you, you are absolutely responsible for what you do with it. I remember working with James, who'd been sexually abused as a child and spent his adult life in a cycle of self-sabotage and isolation. His breakthrough came when he realized that continuing to live as a victim was actually dishonoring his survival and resilience. The shift from, "Why did this happen to me?" to, "How can I use this experience to serve my growth and help others?" transformed his entire relationship with his past. What's fascinating is how the ego uses both blame and self-blame to keep us stuck in familiar patterns. Sometimes we blame others for our circumstances. Sometimes we blame ourselves for not being good enough, smart enough, or healed enough. Both positions are ways of avoiding the present moment responsibility of choosing how to respond to what is. True spiritual maturity comes from recognizing that every person in your life, even those who hurt you, has been a teacher, showing you something about your own unconscious patterns and calling you toward greater wholeness. The most liberating realization is that dropping blame doesn't mean becoming a doormat or pretending everything is okay. It means reclaiming your creative power to write a new story. When you stop defining yourself by your wounds and start defining yourself by your capacity to transform those wounds into wisdom, you step into a completely different version of yourself. You begin to see that every challenge has been perfectly designed to strengthen exactly the qualities you need for your unique contribution to the world. The freedom that comes from releasing blame opens up a new way of engaging with your spiritual journey. But there's a subtle trap that catches even the most sincere seekers, a form of spiritual bypassing that I'm about to reveal that might completely change how you approach your inner work. Michael was a dedicated Buddhist who meditated 2 hours daily and could quote the Dalai Lama from memory, but he came to me because his wife was threatening divorce. "I don't understand," he said. "I've transcended anger and attachment. I practice loving kindness meditation, yet she says I'm emotionally unavailable." As we talked, it became clear that Michael was using his spiritual practice like a shield. Every time difficult emotions arose, he'd retreat to his meditation cushion rather than engage with the messy reality of human relationship. His spiritual awakening began when he realized he wasn't transcending his emotions. He was avoiding them with sophisticated techniques that made his avoidance look enlightened. This spiritual bypassing is everywhere once you start looking for it. People use positive affirmations to avoid feeling their depression, gratitude practices to skip over legitimate anger, or forgiveness work to bypass necessary boundaries. I've seen folks spend thousands on ayahuasca ceremonies seeking cosmic insights while refusing to have an honest conversation with their teenager about curfew. The authentic self isn't found by floating above human experience. It's discovered by diving deep into the full spectrum of what it means to be human, including the uncomfortable parts we'd rather transcend. The most common form of bypassing I encounter is the love and light approach to difficult situations. Someone loses their job and immediately starts talking about how everything happens for a reason, and they're grateful for the opportunity to grow, when what they really need is to feel the fear, anger, and uncertainty that comes with financial instability. True spiritual maturity means being present with what is, not immediately trying to find the silver lining or the lesson. Sometimes life is just hard, and pretending otherwise is a form of spiritual materialism that keeps us disconnected from our genuine experience. I remember David, a meditation teacher who came to me suffering from chronic fatigue. He'd been pushing through exhaustion for months, telling himself that his body was just another illusion to transcend. His healing began when he stopped trying to meditate his way out of his symptoms and started listening to what his body was actually telling him. He needed rest, better nutrition, and honest acknowledgement of the stress in his life. His spiritual practice became about honoring his human needs rather than trying to rise above them. The irony is that true spiritual growth happens through embracing our humanity, not escaping it. When you stop using spiritual concepts as escape hatches from difficult emotions, you discover that those very emotions contain the intelligence and energy needed for authentic transformation. Your anger might be pointing toward necessary boundaries. Your sadness might be honoring what you've lost. Your fear might be protecting something precious. The goal isn't to transcend these experiences, but to move through them with awareness and compassion. Real spiritual work isn't about becoming some untouchable enlightened being who never gets triggered. It's about becoming fully human, someone who can feel deeply, love fiercely, and remain present even when life gets messy. But there's another form of avoidance that's even more subtle, one that disguises itself as spiritual dedication, but is actually fear in disguise. Rebecca convinced herself she was living in sacred solitude, spending months alone in her apartment, avoiding social gatherings and declining invitations from friends. She'd tell people she was on a spiritual retreat from the world's chaos, that she needed to go within to find her authentic self. But the truth was more uncomfortable. She was terrified of being truly seen by others, afraid that if people got too close, they'd discover she wasn't as evolved as her spiritual persona suggested. Her isolation wasn't enlightened detachment. It was sophisticated hiding disguised as spiritual practice. This pattern shows up constantly in spiritual communities. People quit their jobs to follow their bliss, but never actually engage with the practical challenges of creating sustainable work they love. They end relationships claiming they need to work on themselves, but never learn how to be vulnerable and honest in partnership. They move to remote locations seeking peace, but carry their internal conflicts wherever they go. True spiritual awakening doesn't happen in isolation from life. It happens through engaging more deeply and authentically with the world around you. The ego loves spiritual isolation because it feels so much more noble than admitting you're simply scared of intimacy, conflict, or being judged. It's easier to say you're too sensitive for this world than to develop the skills needed to navigate relationships with boundaries and compassion. But spiritual growth requires the friction that comes from rubbing up against other people's perspectives, needs, and triggers. It's in those moments of interpersonal challenge that you discover whether your inner worth is solid or just a concept you've been intellectually understanding. What many don't realize is that isolation often becomes another form of bypassing, avoiding the vulnerable work of learning how to show up authentically in relationship with others. The hermit on the mountain might achieve a certain kind of peace, but they'll never develop the spiritual muscles that come from staying present and open-hearted when someone pushes their buttons. Real individuation happens not through separation from others, but through maintaining your authentic self while remaining genuinely connected to the human community. The spiritual journey isn't about finding a perfect inner state and then protecting it from the world's chaos. It's about developing such a strong connection to your authentic self that you can remain centered while engaging fully with life's complexities. This means having difficult conversations, setting healthy boundaries, feeling your emotions in the presence of others, and allowing yourself to be imperfectly human in relationship. When you stop hiding your process and start sharing your truth, that's when real spiritual community becomes possible. The freedom that comes from ending spiritual isolation opens up possibilities for connection that most people never imagine. Your willingness to be genuinely seen, flaws and all, becomes an invitation for others to drop their masks too, creating the kind of authentic relationships that actually support spiritual growth rather than requiring you to hide from it. Each abandonment you've witnessed creates space for something more authentic. Trading approval for inner worth, specialness for genuine uniqueness, performed happiness for real vulnerability, certainty for trust in the unknown, blame for creative power, bypassing for embodied presence, and isolation for true connection. This isn't a linear process. Sometimes you'll let go, sometimes you'll grip tight again, but each cycle gets lighter. Remember, spiritual awakening isn't about perfection. It's about becoming more real. You might find yourself slipping back into old approval-seeking patterns during stressful times, or catching yourself performing happiness when you're actually sad. That's not failure, that's awareness. The fact that you notice these patterns means you're already free from their unconscious grip. You're not losing anything essential, you're finally finding yourself. Are you ready to trust this process of becoming who you've always been underneath all those masks? What would your life look like if you gave yourself permission to be authentically, imperfectly, beautifully human? If you recognize yourself in this journey, share your experience in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Subscribe to continue exploring these transformations, and remember, your awakening is a gift not just to yourself, but to everyone whose life you touch with your authentic presence.